might need an ambulance on that one. I saw it, it was not good.
From the cobbled bergs of Belgium to the beautiful Dolomite peaks of Italy, and from the dirt roads of Colorado to pavement around this country, I've tested the 3T Strada Due for about a year now with the relatively new SRAM Red eTap axis group. In this video, I'm going to give you my take on both the bike and the group and how those have performed in these various climates.
Sheep. Fascinating.
You'll forgive me if this review is a tad more sentimental than most. I'm filming this here in early April when my heart is still in Belgium for the classics that are not happening, and my heart is certainly going out to the folks in Italy. 3T is based in Bergamo, which has obviously been hit very hard by the coronavirus. 3T has been doing a remarkable job in rallying, not only to keep its business going, but almost more importantly to change its business to help produce valves for breathing devices to support the countrymen and their healthcare workers now. But let's talk about bikes. A few things to know about the 3T Strada. It is an aero bike engineered for wide tires, wide rims. Now, a lot of aero bikes these days have clearance for wide tires, which are all the rage, right? You'll see 28 mil tires almost as standard on normal road bikes and even on a lot of aero bikes. Take the Scott Foil, for instance. But the 3T Strada is designed to integrate wide tires and rims into the aerodynamic package. Now, can I feel an aerodynamic benefit from one frame to the other? If we're talking big picture, like coasting downhill at speed, sitting upright versus tucking down, yes, I can feel that. And maybe I can feel the change in a bike with box rims to a full-on aero bike with super deep wheels, especially when there's crosswinds. But can I feel the difference in a frame as far as an aero frame versus a normal frame? Of course not. However, I do believe in the fundamental physics at work. And one thing you should know is the folks at 3T know what they're doing when it comes to aerodynamics. There's a lot of sharp people there, including Gerard Brumman, who is the co-founder of Cervelo, obviously a pioneer in aerodynamic bicycles. And those folks worked hard to develop this bike to be aero not just in a wind tunnel at high speeds, but at low speeds and with real-world conditions like bottles on the frame. And I've been in enough wind tunnels around the world and looked at enough presentations to believe that yes, aerodynamics is a thing. Now, one thing I can feel is how a bike feels to ride. And this is where the wide portion comes into play. You're probably familiar with a wider tire at a lower pressure being more comfortable than a skinnier tire at higher pressure, right? You've just got more suspension. And that is one of the sweet things about this bike. It can handle up to a 30 millimeter measured tire with plenty of clearance. It comes stock with 25 millimeter tires, which on the super fat rims, which are 25 mil internal, they plump up to 30 mil, which is huge. I went ahead and put on some 28 mil Schwalbe Tubeless Pro 1s, and it felt so good riding on cobbles, riding on dirt roads. You know, you can take the pressures down to 50 and still be cruising right along. So riding and racing on the cobbles for old roadies like me, it's a romantic thing, right? But it is not exactly a real world situation for most of us in our everyday riding. However, it does make for a great test bed, whether you're looking at tires or handlebars or just the overall comfort. Things get shaken out pretty quickly. One pet peeve I have is fussy little bolts that don't hold up. The seat post clamp bolt on this bike slipped a little bit when I had it tightened to the recommended spec. So I called Gerard, hey, bolt slipping here under my big old butt. I've got the thing at spec, what should I do? He says, just make sure you got enough carbon paste on there and tighten down a little bit more. So I did, going beyond the recommended spec. The seat post made some screechy noises, but it held, had no problems. So that was one thing that the cobble shook out, was that what works well on smooth roads doesn't necessarily work when things start rumbling around. Just above the seat post clamp, the seat post is something that is worthy of praise. Carbon posts can be engineered to flex to however the engineer team wants them set. One downside to some aero posts, if you have a big, deep cross section, is that effectively cuts down on the amount of flex you can have. The post here is relatively skinny front to back, and so there is a bit of flex there, which next to the tires is the biggest place where you feel comfort in a bike. And so I think 3T did a great job there. I've been going to the cobbled races as a journalist and as a play along fanboy on my own bike for a couple decades now. Love those things. I've taken a number of bikes over the years or gone for different bike launches, like Specialized Roubaix, Delaney, what have you, bikes that are built for these type of events. I have also taken bikes on both ends of the narrow race to big fat comfort spectrum. Everything from a Scott foil, not so comfy to ride, but certainly gets the job done, to like a monster cross bike with 50mm tires. I certainly enjoyed having that for the Paris-Roubaix sportive a few years ago. I found 50mm to be overkill because while it's certainly comfortable on cobbles, it's a lot of rubber and you feel the weight of that every time you go to accelerate. And on the pavement, it's a little too much for my taste. There's certainly not a lot of clearance, so make no mistake, this is not a gravel bike, but it does have gravel bike-like comfort for rough surfaces. I enjoyed the bike so much at the Sportives. I did both the Ghent-Wevelgem one last year and the Tour of Flanders, my out-and-out favorite, hands down, in the world. I enjoyed it so much in those two that when I went to Italy with my buddies for a vacation in the Dolomites, I brought this bike along. A couple reasons why. We were doing primarily road rides, going up and down the beautiful famed climbs there like the Jow. But the highlight of the ride was the Dolomites 5000.
3, 2, 1, go!
This crazy gravel ride, named for the 5,000 meters of elevation over less than 80 miles, is dreamed up and put on by Igor Tavella, a wonderful gentleman who also runs a hotel where we stayed for the week. The event was dreamed up by Igor and the photo-dynamic duo of Ashley and Jared Gruber, trying to come up with the craziest way to have an adventure and hit 5,000 meters in the shortest amount of time. This bike seemed like the perfect one, again, the Goldilocks solution for doing a lot of road riding up and down mountains where you don't want to be dragging a heavy bike or heavy tires along, but something that is beefy and comfortable enough for rattling around on fire roads and some single track where you're like, is this even a trail? I mean, at some point I was walking through a marshy bog. It's not a road ride, but it was a heck of a day on the bike. And while a gravel bike would have been ideal for some of the spots, for the whole day, 3T Strada was fantastic. Another small detail that adds to the comfort package is the handlebar. 3T's Super Ergo bar has a slightly flattened top, which makes for a big difference, I think, because it just spreads out the pressure on your palms a bit. And on this bike, there's a nice smooth transition from the bar to the SRAM Red eTap Access hoods. So the wider the area and the smoother the transition, the happier my hands are. Now let's talk about the group. SRAM's new Red eTap Access has a few noticeable differences from its predecessor. For one, it's 12-speed. For second, there is a big change in the gearing. The chain rings are much smaller and the cassette goes down to a 10, which is unlike anything else out there on the market, where the 11-tooth is the smallest you can get from Shimano or Campagnolo. But more practically, there are some things that I noticed and appreciated. For instance, the shifting is a bit quicker when you press the buttons than the old Red. Another thing is the brakes engage a little more quickly in the lever throw than the old Red. I jumped back and forth between the new Red bike and an old tarmac that I have with the old Red, just to compare. And just so you know, my comparison had the same apples to apples setup. SRAM's lead technical whiz, Nate Newton, set up both bikes, so it wasn't this chucklehead's suspect mechanical ability that had those changes. So again, faster shifting and a slightly quicker brake engagement are two everyday things that I appreciate. Another thing about eTap you should know is the batteries, as in plural. While Shimano and Campagnolo have a single battery powering the whole system, SRAM has interchangeable batteries, one that sits on the front derailleur and one at the rear. This, I think, makes for a more user-friendly system, if for no other reason than it sucks less when your battery dies than it does on the other two. So with Shimano, for instance, when your battery starts to go out, you lose the ability to shift the big ring, and so you limp home in the small ring and you've still got some shifts on the rear. With SRAMs, when one battery dies, you can swap the two around. So you're still not getting full shifting capabilities, but at least, when you come to the bottom of a hill, you can flip the batteries around, put it in the small ring, ride up to the top while still being able to shift the rear. Then when you get to the top, you can swap the batteries again to shift your front derailleur. Of course, this is kind of a hack system, not ideal, but I will tell you it is far superior than just limping home a long way without being able to use your front derailleur at all. One thing I learned in Belgium last year was riding with my friend Dries over the cobbles, and he had an older red bike that would not shift perfectly every time when we were on the cobbles. Come to find out, the little tab that holds the battery in was worn ever so slightly, so the battery would rattle around. It didn't have a nice tight seal. That was easily fixed with a new battery. Again, talked to SRAM's Nate Newton about this. He said that is something that can happen, although it's very rare. It's never happened to me, but just something to be aware of. Another battery thing with SRAM's system that I learned in Italy was, hey, what happens when the shifter battery goes out? So in addition to the interchangeable batteries on the derailleurs themselves, the shifters have little coin cell batteries in them to send the wireless signal to the derailleurs. My right shifter went out on a ride. We were out for, 6-7 hours, beautiful day in the Dolomites, and the right shifter stopped working. So I realized that SRAM has buttons on each of the derailleurs, which can be used. Typically you use those when you've got the bike in the work stand. You're trying to, when you're cleaning your chain or getting the system dialed in, you can use those manual buttons on the derailleurs to shift. I used those on the last, 2 hours of the ride or so to get myself back to our hotel. The front derailleur I could shift, while riding a little precariously, but come to the bottom of the hill, I could reach down and shift that. The rear I would just have to leave alone, or when we got to a steep section, I'd climb off the bike and manually press the rear derailleur button. So not ideal, but again, it's just good to have a backup. I had brought a coin battery for my Stages power meter, so when we got back to the hotel, I was happy to see that plugged in just fine to the lever and we were good to go. I did, however, very much appreciate the low gear of the 3528. That came in handy quite a bit, climbing in the Dolomites on pavement and certainly on dirt and gravel where I could stay in the saddle and spin that tiny little gear ever so slowly up. And I also didn't feel like I ran out of gear on the top end. Certainly able to pedal down hills as well. One thing about the Strada Due, or the Strada Due, is that it's exceptional in that it has 2 chain rings. Why is that exceptional? Well, of course, almost all road bikes for a very long time since the triple went away have had 2 chain rings. It works very well. Now, of course, you're aware SRAM made a push for a while for single ring road bikes to be a thing. I tried some of those early options and just felt like I never had enough rope on either end. Either you gave up on the small end or you gave up on the tall end. So I did a few modifications to this bike. Some intentional and a couple unintentional. For one, I swapped out the skinny Sella San Marco Aspide saddle. It's far too narrow for my wide rumpus, and put on my trusty old Specialized Power. Put on a longer stem to get my position right, and I put on the Schwalbe 28mm Tubeless Tires, which did not flat despite much abuse over cobbles and dirt and rocks and what have you. There might have been a couple tiny little holes, unbeknownst to me, over the course of the year, but sealant sealed them up and never had to put a tube in the thing. Underneath said Specialized Power saddle, I put on the multi-tool that Specialized provides, which you can bolt onto the saddle, which is nice. One thing that kind of irks me about many of these new disc bikes is that they don't have a lever the way a quick release bike always has a lever. Some will have a single lever, some have none. This is one of those, so you have to have a multi-tool in order to get your wheel off in case you do flat. Never did flat, never needed it, but it'd be dumb not to have that capability. So having a tool that is literally bolted to the bike for someone like me who doesn't always think of these things is a good solution. I also made a couple of accidental modifications to this bike. Sorry, Gerard and 3T crew. One was the tires I put on, the 28 mils, which pumped up to 33, were a little too wide. And I realized they rubbed on the frame, rubbing off a little bit of the carbon. Sorry about that. The second was I managed to crash myself in the Dolomites quite nicely. I was filming with my GoPro, holding it in the hand. I had it in my head it would be good to get a portrait set up instead of landscape so it would look better on a phone. Long story short, crashed myself right into a guardrail and cracked my pelvis, and also skidded off a bit of the shifter on the right hand side and the derailleur. Again, my apologies, Gerard and 3T.
We might need an ambulance on that one. I saw it, it was not good.
Bottom line, I love riding this bike. From Belgium to Italy to Colorado, it excelled pretty much every place I put it, and the only real qualm I have with it is the seat post binder. And that, once I got it dialed, really was no longer an issue. The bike isn't cheap at $8,000, but I do believe it offers something fairly unique in the world of aero road bikes, which is a comfortable ride and aerodynamics that are dialed for the wide tires. Lastly, you should note that 3T has been doing some great work for its local hospital in Bergamo. It's raised more than $25,000 as of early April. It transitioned some of its manufacturing capabilities from bike stuff to life-saving stuff, making valves for breathing devices. So kudos to you guys, 3T. And in that spirit, I hope you are taking this review in the spirit in which it was made. That's talking about bicycles for recreation at a time when so many people, including those in Italy, are suffering, could seem a little trite or tone deaf. But the spirit in which I am offering it up is a remembrance of the good times we have had in the past and looking forward to the good times we will again have in the future.